Hello, everyone. I'm Marilyn Suchan, a producer of Catalyst, and today I want to introduce you to your host, Charlie McCarron. So Charlie's going to be hosting a 3-part series on music. So go ahead and leave all your questions and comments, questions in the comments section, and I'll be collecting those behind the scenes for Charlie. So without further ado, take it away, Charlie.
Thanks, Marilyn. Yeah, I'm excited to be hosting this 3-part series on music and film and TV. And as a composer myself, I'm excited to talk to this whole great group we have. And so I'll give a quick plug to the other 2 sessions too while we're here. So next Monday, we're going to have a talk on music contracts. We'll have 2 entertainment lawyers to answer all your questions about that. And then the final session will be Tuesday, May 26th on composition and orchestration. And we have the composer for Rick and Morty, Ryan Elder, and also Robert Elhai, who's done 200 films, orchestrations from Frida to the Fast and Furious series. So yeah, those will be good sessions too. But today, what we're going to talk about is where do you get started with film music? So our guests here, I want to introduce them, and I'll ask them, how did you get started working on music for the projects you're working on? So I'll start here with Norah Shapiro and Tom Scott. Norah's an Emmy-winning documentary director and producer. Most recently produced Time for Ilhan, which is a wonderful documentary about our representative Ilhan Omar. And Tom Scott, the composer, worked on that with Norah. And Tom's also worked on a ton of other cool projects, including Mystery Science Theater 3000, the Netflix reboot. So Norah and Tom, why don't you talk briefly about how you met and how you got started working on Time for Ilhan, and then we'll show a clip of the intro. So, yeah.
Boy, I'm trying to think how. I think we met through a mutual friend, and actually. And I think an interesting part of this process, this conversation, the creative process, we had worked on a previous film.
Yeah, we did meet through a mutual filmmaker friend. And that was just as you were getting started on the film before this one, Miss Tibet.
Right, right. And that was my first, not my first experience working with a composer, having an original score. And actually, Tom stepped in that one to sort of fill in some spots. He didn't for the whole film, but there were some spots that we needed some original music where we couldn't get the rights. But that process was so fabulous and so intriguing for me that I was sold. And I loved working with Tom, and so it was a natural when this next project came up. And I would say that in terms of the process, I learned so much at each stage that fed into the ongoing thing. In terms of it took me a while to learn how to do this from the perspective of not being a composer and not feeling like I was fluent in that language. It was an interesting process for me. Tom, do you want to sort of chime in on that from your side of the equation?
Sure, yeah. I think the most challenging thing in a director-composer relationship is communication and having a common language. You know, it's like that old quote, you know, talking about music is like dancing about architecture. For us who live in our music bubble, you know, we can use instrument terminology, we can use, you know, notation, we can use Italian classical terminology. But for most storytellers and filmmakers and editors, they just don't have that vocabulary. So my thing is always, how do we develop a relationship where we can actually communicate and get out of the way of a lot of people have fear about talking about music. So I think like job number one is sweep that aside and let's just figure out how we talk.
Right.
And then I guess the other thing I would say about how we got started on this particular film is I always have this mantra about instead of like as a composer chasing temp, if we can actually help create the temp by providing some of our own library or maybe some preliminary sketches if we feel confident enough about creating sketches like that. If we can provide that to the editor or the director early on in the process and just say, hey, I know you're just getting started, but if anything in here is ringing any bells or resonating, maybe you could try cutting to this, because it is so much easier developing your own work than someone else's. And then also, you know, it's a good way to avoid temp love, where people have been hanging out in their edit suite with the same piece of music for months, because I mean, that's what documentary filmmaking is, or any filmmaking, but particularly in the documentary world, you're sitting on footage for years sometimes. So anything we can do to front load that process by getting our original music in early on is helpful.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, go ahead, Charlie.
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah. So yeah, we will be able to dive in even more later, but any other things that we should know for the setup to this intro? And like, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I would add before you play the clip, the opening, is that this particular story was set in a very particular community and culture that in and of itself was walking a duality. And by that I mean this was a film set inside the immigrant Somali community in Minneapolis. And so we were very, very mindful from the get-go of what that meant in terms of the musical influences and that duality, and wanting to be true and yet not too hung up on either, you know, an urban sound or a Somali Eastern African sound, and yet those influences were very much there from the beginning. And so I think knowing that we went in knowing that we had to juggle that is helpful to know when you see and you hear what you're about to see.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's watch the clip from Time for Ilhan, and I'll get that going here on my end. Okay.
Okay, all done. You're all pretty.
Right now, we have an ability to exercise a right that a lot of our parents didn't have, a right to have a voice in this country, to be able to say and do the things that matter. This week is actually National Voter Registration Week, so I urge you.
I think coming to the United States and being part of a democracy.
So yeah, great intro, and I'm excited to ask you more about it in a bit. But next, I want to introduce Andy Thompson. Andy's an all-around musical wizard. He's a composer, orchestrator, producer. Most recently worked on Dessa's album with the Minnesota Orchestra. Did all the orchestration for that. And Andy, you've produced all of Jeremy Messersmith's albums, and you've gotten to work with a ton of cool artists, including Taylor Swift. I think you did a little music for her. And but the other side that you have is as a film composer and commercial composer. So I thought it'd be interesting to show a clip of a commercial that you wrote for Garmin GPS. And then I'll have you talk a little bit about that side of it. Like, how does it work when you are working on music that's going to be licensed in different things, or, you know, that kind of thing. So let's watch that clip from Garmin. And let me get that up.
Turn right onto Elizabeth Street. Traffic ahead. Arriving at processing crowd.
So there you go. Not the typical soundtrack that you'd expect, maybe, but Andy, how did that work?
So that project was actually brought to me by a good mutual friend of Tom and I, Ken Chastain. And it was the kind of thing, a lot of times this happens like commercials, where the ad agency will want to hear many demos, right? They'll want to hear a lot of versions, a bunch of people's takes on a song. So Ken came to me, and that was actually a Super Bowl ad. And he said, hey, I've got the chance to do a Super Bowl ad. And I said, great. What is it? And he says, well, it's going to be like post-punk. I'm like, okay, I can do that. And I guess as a musician, like I don't primarily write for film or write for commercials, but it's something I do, I think, based on what people know of my album production. So he had this kind of post-punk rock and roll thing, and I had been doing a lot of that, playing live and producing records. So he came to me, and I said, that's great. And then he says, but there's a catch. Lyrics have to be in French. And I said, okay. I took some French in high school. And luckily, my best friend is fluent in French, lived there for a while. So I called him up, and we got together. It was a very quick turnaround. We had like 2 days to do this, which it always seems like the turnarounds are bonkers in that world. I'm not quite sure why. Maybe Tom would know more about that. But he basically said, yeah, in 2 days, get me a minute-long post-punk song in French. And he did have one reference. So in this situation, like a lot of times there will be a sound alike. The agency will, the creative people there will kind of focus on an existing song. And obviously there's dark sides to sound alikes, and there have been some recent legal cases and stuff like that. But in this case, it was a Plastic Bertrand song, who was a Belgian guy in the late 70s. So we got together, I did the music, Chris wrote the lyrics. He's not a songwriter. He's like a huge music fan, and like he used to DJ and stuff like that. So he's got like a good instinctual sense. So I kind of took his lyrics and made them fit the song. And then actually the vocal on that track is he and I both singing in unison the whole thing.
That's awesome.
And I think I did that version and then one other one, but it just kind of stuck. There were some revisions, there were some alternate mixes with different instruments and stuff like that. But that kind of just floated through the process. There's always a lot of people with a lot of opinions on a project, like a commercial period, but also a Super Bowl commercial. Like, you know, it's not cheap airtime, so they want to get it right. So yeah, that just kind of floated through to the final cut, and it was a fun project.
That's great. Yeah, the sound alike thing, that's something I'm going to ask the lawyers about in the next session, because it's a tricky thing.
It's always been tricky. And yeah, in the last couple of years, it's gotten even a little more tricky. Yeah.
So, and our final panelist is a good friend of mine, Jason P. Schumacher, narrative filmmaker who has done tons of short films and feature films, works on a lot of projects around here. So, Jason, I wanted to show a clip from This Is Home, a short film that's pretty personal in nature. So I want to ask you about that to set up this clip. And yeah, we worked together. I did the music for it. It was a fun project to work on. So Jason, tell us a little bit. This Is Home.
Yeah, it is a personal project, and it's so it's about a young kid in the 90s growing up around alcoholism and sort of the you know, the kind of ups and downs of that, not necessarily an explosive thing, but just kind of this ever-present thing in his life, even though his parents are loving. And so the trick with this film, especially with the music, was getting the tone right, because we didn't want to be like, this is so sad, or plucky because you're watching a kid. And it was really, and I think it's the most revisions you and I have ever done on anything, for sure. So yeah, it's just like a tricky tone to hit. So
yeah. All right, let's watch the scene from kind of the middle of This Is Home.
Hey. Not bad. Hey. Not good either. But... Hey.
Gotta get some groceries. This fridge is barren.
So yeah, that scene in particular, I think that was inspired by Radiohead.
That is the temp music that I ended up putting in there, and maybe also one of the closer instances of falling in love with the temp music. So
Yeah.
I think it did. Yeah, it did have some vibes of that Radiohead song for sure that stayed with it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think I was kind of resistant to like guitar, but you were like, oh, I think we should have a guitar, and just concerned about hearing guitar in some of those kind of, I don't know, movies about people of a lower income or something. It just felt, I was concerned it was going to be too on the nose or something that we'd seen before or heard before. So it was interesting that you kind of steered me back towards that, and I wasn't sure if percussion was going to work because it's also supposed to be sort of lost and drifting, and just kind of showing that they kind of almost goalless and just not terribly aspirational, just kind of drifting along, and this kid is just kind of along for the ride, and
So we'll get into kind of the creative side of using music in a bit, but first, I think a lot of directors and producers watching are probably wondering, like, where do you get started with finding music for your film? Like, where do you meet someone who might compose, or do you find a music supervisor, or, and what are the different options for different budget levels? Because not everyone has a giant music budget. Anyone could take it away if you have thoughts.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, but I'll just talk about one. How do you meet filmmakers? Speaking as a composer, I mean, that's really the challenge, because we live in a bubble. We work in our studios. We get to work with other musicians, but our interactions are primarily with other musical types. So the real challenge is how we meet composers, or I'm sorry, how we meet filmmakers. And so that's always taken extra work on my end, like trying to go out, see local film premieres, go out to the film festivals that your city is supporting, and stick around for the panel conversations. But it really sort of forces you to get out of your comfort zone and go out and meet people, because it's still a mystery to me. How do you network and make more, jump that bridge to the other side from audio to visual?
Yeah, and you and I met very, very randomly we went to high school together, and then ended up working at the same video production place. And I found out you did music, and you helped me with sound design. And so that was just kind of a happenstance almost, but it continued to work out, fortunately. But I would say also just not to be afraid to reach out to musicians that you like or that you follow, or musicians that you've heard in other people's films. We did this film called The Chairman, where the director wanted, and I was the producer, the director wanted this kind of vaporwave soundtrack, and he just ended up reaching out to a guy whose music he really liked and followed, and was like, hey, would you be interested in this? And he said, yeah, and it was in our price range, and he was willing to work with us on an independent short, so don't be afraid to ask.
Yeah, I'll just chime in that those are, so it's very interesting. You can start, you don't have to start with from 0 to 100. You can work on a shorter piece, or you can be making something and think, oh yeah, this musician, I like that song. There's this local musician, reach out that way. That's a very different thing than working with a composer who can cut to either your footage, or you can get a sample, the way Tom was discussing earlier, or can understand stings, or taking a musical theme and waving it through. But just from this perspective of how do you start, I think that was my process back at the very beginning when I first reached out to a local musician, and I liked a song and I thought it would work for a particular thing. But that opened up the conversation. The other thing that people can do if either their budget doesn't allow, or they don't yet know composers, they're working on building those relationships and that networking, is there are libraries and there are services, some of whom offer you can get original things composed on spec, or you can start working with the various components of a song, and it'll be, whatever your small budget is.
Norah, do you know off the top of your head, like what
Artlist is one that I've used. And obviously nothing is as good as working with an incredibly talented composer, the likes of you guys. But for people who are either starting or are earlier on that journey, it's also a really good way, I have found, for back to Tom's other point about coming up with a language and a way to communicate in terms of the music as well as the story. Just playing around, spending hours on those sites with, linking, you'll pick a mood or a theme or and tempo, and playing around with those variables as a director, as a non-composer. I found that to help my comfort level talking about it.
Yeah.
I also the only other thing, sorry, I'll just say is that creatively, I mean, I love the collaborative parts of the work of creating a final piece, like you saw, that little excerpt is the best part of this work for me. And the collaborating with Tom on the score was, I've never practically been more excited. I mean, it was such a delight, and I was completely out of my element. And even though I consider myself fairly musical, and but I'm by no means a composer. And once you give yourself over and you're in the zone with the right composer, it is the most fun, the best thing. And I can't wait to find myself at that stage again on my next project. So people shouldn't be afraid. And they composers also who are, especially, I think you guys can chime in, but who are doing a lot of commercial work on the side or all kinds of other things, also might be more receptive to working on your project than you think they might, is another piece to add.
Yeah. I was going to say something that's happened recently, just with the, explosion, Instagram and YouTube, like when a band or an artist puts out a record, there's a lot of visual content that is created for the singles, or whether it's a 15-second Instagram thing. And I've met really cool photographers and filmmakers through just that process, who I wouldn't necessarily have met. So I produced a record by a band called Graveyard Club recently, and they reached out to somebody they knew, friends of friends, to make a video. It was awesome. So I emailed her and I said, that's a great video, so just kind of random connections that happen. And, a lot of these people are operating independently, but they're creating really cool stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's important too, to just find those people that are maybe into some of the same things that you're into. So it isn't like a force, you're trying to force somebody too far one direction or another,
Yeah. It's a little more organic that way. You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll add, just on the composer end, when we were talking about like getting temp music in there and creating it yourself. One thing I like to do is I have all my soundtracks available for other filmmakers to try out as temp music in their films. And sometimes they end up scoring their whole film with, like another one of my film scores, but then we replace everything. And it's a good way for a filmmaker to get to know how a composer sounds paired with their stuff, that it's going to be kind of similar to what you get probably from them. So yeah, with that, I guess it'd be good to talk about like maybe some music specific things in terms of like, what is the difference between using digital sampled instruments versus, like, Tom, you just sent me a clip of the Macedonian Symphony Orchestra playing your thing, which actually I'd love to show that clip too. when we get to it. But maybe Tom or Andy, you could kind of describe like what are the differences in different budget levels that filmmakers might have.
Go for it, Tom.
I mean, obviously the budget levels they run the spectrum, and you know, I still do some work for nothing, for love, but obviously you want to be able to work with musicians, I guess. You know, as a composer, if you're strictly being a composer, you spend so much time in isolation. I mean, like in reality, the COVID thing is not that different from my workflow as far as like being holed up in my studio at my rig. And I guess that's why we love working with musicians, especially fantastic musicians. Where I live in Minnesota, we have just world-class musicians. And so every opportunity I get, I will get at least one on my track. And the samples, like the digital representations that we have access to now are really incredible. And honestly, a lot of the people that we play our mock-ups to, I mean, there's a chance they could fall in love with your mock-up, and when you actually track it, they actually have temp love for your mock-up. But nonetheless, that's probably a rare instance, but we just are always pushing to get real musicians involved as much as possible. And so I guess the short answer is we can do amazing things with samples, but it's always a preference to turn that into a recording with as many real instruments and musicians as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just to kind of echo what Tom was saying, I feel like a lot of composers these days, out of either necessity or just efficiency, are kind of jacks of all trades, where we can play multiple instruments, we can engineer ourselves. But yeah, we get lonely sometimes, so it's good to bring in real people. I've also noticed too a trend where there's kind of like a feedback loop maybe between the composers and then the composers creating sample sets, and then those sample sets being used by other composers, where everything kind of starts to sound the same. There's a very famous sample library company called Spitfire, but the sound of their stuff is kind of the sound of like BBC drama. And so if you're using those instruments in the ways that they're naturally used in, your stuff kind of starts to have shades of that. So I always like to, even if the budget does not make it possible to hire an orchestra or even a string quartet or something like that, you know, by definition, when somebody records an instrument live for the first time, like that sound has never been heard exactly like that in the world. So it's even using those as starting points and creating your own, not necessarily a sampled instrument, but just textures that by definition have never been heard before, is a nice way to kind of get outside your own composing box and create something that's new.
Yeah.
Can I piggyback on that real quick?
Yeah.
Just talking about how the latest in technology tends to become the thing that we're excited about, and subsequently it can become a trend. I've been doing this long enough where I can listen back to stuff I did, 15, 20 years ago, where I was leaning heavily on the latest thing, and it doesn't always age well. But the thing that I find about recording good musicians and getting a quality recording, that's, I think, how you create timeless things. There's just something about that, something in the air, the extra magic, whatever you want to talk about. It's unquantifiable.
Yeah. Well, Tom, how about we show your Mystery Science Theater 3000 video you sent me.
Great.
And let's...
Can I give a setup for this?
Yes, for sure.
Because everybody's watching this on a laptop or a phone or something, and we are about to watch an orchestra on a laptop. So this is totally meta here, what's about to happen. But it's from a recording session, a remote recording session for the orchestral theme for Mystery Science Theater 3000, the Netflix reboot that came out a few years ago. The actual composer was Charlie Erickson, and I worked as an orchestrator with him on that. So this is footage from our session. We're in our studio watching the orchestral recording take place.
All right.
Awesome.
That's great. So what I think is very interesting about this is you're using an orchestra in Macedonia, and but you're streaming from Minneapolis, and yeah, how does that work? Let's say, I think a lot of people are wondering, like, how would you actually hire an orchestra for your film if you wanted to go that route?
Well, a lot of European and mostly Eastern European orchestras have really been striving to be competitive with composers or for composers in the UK and the United States and other places. They have the rich orchestral classical tradition. They have great sounding halls. They have great engineers. It's just people have started to get very savvy about being middlemen, connectors between them and people like us who maybe don't have a Hollywood budget but want to work with a real orchestra. And I became familiar, I actually loved a Swedish film called Let the Right One In, and there was a composer, Johan Söderqvist, who did the score, and I loved the score. And so I'm reading the liner notes, and I find out about this group that he worked with in Bratislava. And so I had been working on an independent film, and I just thought it would be a great opportunity to try to work that way. So I had been looking around for a while, and I came across this particular group. But basically what happens is you buy your block of time, and you provide them with your charts, you know, broken down by each stand, and a full score for the conductor. And you get an allotted amount of time, and they'll set up a recording session time. They'll provide you with a separate audio link. So your speakers can be dedicated to the true audio signal. I believe they use a place called Source Connect Live. So your speakers are receiving, you know, full bandwidth representation of what's being recorded, but you have like a Skype interaction with the conductor on a separate device. And so that's basically how it works. And you just try to manage your time just like you would do for any session here, and just make sure all your preparation is in order so there's no surprises when it comes time to record.
Yeah. And Andy, your experience working with like Minnesota Orchestra or other smaller orchestras, yeah, how does that process work for you when you're producing a record or doing a score?
It's a little different working with the Minnesota Orchestra. The one big recording project I did with them was the live record they did with Dessa, who's a hip hop pop artist from Minneapolis. She splits her time between Minneapolis and New York. And that's a little different because that type of performing orchestra is very, very expensive. Just the per minute cost is like astounding. So like we knew we wanted to do this project, and the way that we could get it done with any semblance of a realistic budget was to make it a live album instead of a studio album, because then you're basically offsetting the recording costs by selling 2,000 tickets per night to the show. At least you're offsetting some of it. so that's what we did. And also, I mean, that was just, it definitely added extra challenge. Because, 2,000 people is like 2,000 extra variables that you can't control, but it also added just this kind of sense of danger and just that, like, that energy that only live music can bring, So that's basically how it worked. And a guy named Grant Meacham at the orchestra, who's kind of a miracle worker, just, had a giant spreadsheet and worked with Laserbeak, who runs Doomtree Records, and just figured out how to make the budget work. So we were able to record 2 separate shows, identical set lists, I think. Maybe we did them in different orders, I don't remember. But we did 2 back-to-back shows. And then after that second show, we had like right around an hour to do a patch session, which started at like 11 p.m. And it was basically hit all the spots that maybe weren't the most awesome from the 2 nights. So it was a lot of like, we did the first show, then we all got together and listened, with our under the microscope and marked all the spots, do the second show. And then I'm backstage with headphones on, making sure that everything's working. And we took it down to the wire, but afterwards you have, this enormous hard drive with bunch of amazing music on it, and then the whole mixing process. But yeah, it was a trip and a different process than working those kinds of like Minnesota Orchestra is a major orchestra, and it's like an institution, so you're kind of the moving parts, they don't move quickly, and there's some inertia there, so just making that work was a trick, but yeah, it worked out great.
Yeah, very cool. So I'd love to touch on how you decide. So maybe you have a composer, but also maybe you want to use like licensed music or existing music. And Jason and Norah, I'd love to hear your thoughts too about how do you decide creatively, like when you would use an original composition versus like an existing song.
Well, I mean, we probably all had the thing happen where you fall in love, the danger of the temp piece that you really don't want to be a temp piece. You actually really want it. And that happened to me in my very first film. And it was, of all things, it was a Lauryn Hill song and little did I know that, and I was convinced that if I could get to her, she actually would say yes, she'd love the project. And finally, either the cost is prohibitive, or there's some other, you can't get the rights, or there's something. So, I mean, if you are working in the scale that I at least have always tended full licensing for a pre-existing hit piece of music that might, perfectly capture the zeitgeist or the tone or the this or the that. Never say never, but I've learned the hard way about being very careful about the temp music. This sounds like, but you do have to, even with Tom, say, giving me temp things, sometimes you start earlier and you're working on sample music. So even at that point, you do start cutting to things, because a lot of times, to Tom's earlier point as well, you need music to cut to. And then that's just this navigating in this dance, this negotiating. But I would urge people away from falling in love with unless you're incredibly well funded, and that's part of the budgeting process from the get-go. I would tend to urge people away from that, without saying never say never. But Jason, do you have a different perspective on this?
Yeah, I mean, I've on the producing side, I've definitely run into where filmmakers are convinced that we can use a certain song, and I just have to tell them that no, there's no way. It's surprisingly expensive, and as you guys know, like there's the recording rights, and then there's the rights of the actual song itself,
right,
the composition, and it's just kind of, it's a big hole to go down. So you have to really, really want that song and be able to afford it. So I've directed quite a few music videos as well as a filmmaker, and I've been fortunate to only direct things for bands I really love mostly, and so I've also been able to connect with them and sometimes use some of their music or tie it in. And, you know, I usually try to have a custom soundtrack as much as possible to really fit the film, because I think that's part of the discovery process of the film, you know, and I always look forward to that part of the process too, because, you know, editing can be such a slog. So getting to some of the other things, composing in color, it's, you know, you kind of breathe life into a film, and just seeing the composer kind of add their layer onto it, I think, is always really an exciting process. So,
yeah. And one other question I think that directors have, I mean, Tom, you touched on this, and Norah too, about the fears around working with a composer and how do you communicate. And the one piece that I would love to ask you about is the feedback part. Like, let's say the composer is not giving you what you want. Like, how, I know from personal experience, there's usually a lot of iterations, especially at the beginning of a project. But how do you communicate with the filmmaker and composer?
You want to go on that, Norah?
Sure, I'll start and then you can jump in. I mean, Tom was incredibly helpful with helping to ask questions, to get at pulling apart, teasing apart. If I didn't necessarily at the top, like I would start and I'd say, okay, well, this particular one, something's not working about it. And he had great patience for one thing, but developed a way of, is it this piece? Is it giving me sort of a menu of things that added language for me that I didn't even know, elements, helping me to put language to something that I didn't necessarily have the words to articulate. So that was helpful. And the more we worked together and the more we were each time in the process, you get in a groove and it starts to flow more, or you have other things that are reference points. Like there would be occasionally a time where I couldn't get across what it was and Tom couldn't quite tell. And I don't know how we broke through those impasses, Tom. I mean, one of the things we did, I'll tell you, on this last one that was different is I went in to the studio a couple times with him. And so Tom was able to, I'd say, no, there's this kind of a sound, and then he could take away or add to isolate, that allowed me to say, that's the thing. It's this like nails on a chalkboard thing that's buried under there, that by pulling away elements, but I didn't have the
language. Was my voice, Norah.
Yeah, it's probably my voice. But, Tom was incredibly gracious, incredibly patient, but that was also really empowering, because then I stopped feeling like, oh, I'm stupid. I don't have the words to articulate this thing that I should be able to say. So we just got there, but it took a level of patience and a level of, it doesn't just happen automatically. Tom, am I kind of hitting it?
No, and that's actually a good reminder for me, because, we've all been working in these digital environments for a while now, where we just get accustomed to sending QuickTimes or MP3s, and we're creating through the internet. I mean, I'm talking before the situation we're living in now.
Right.
So that was actually a great reminder for me, because we were sort of at a frustrating point where it's like some stuff just wasn't working on repeated tries.
Right.
But when she could come in and I could show her my Pro Tools session, and go, what in here is bothering you or just not hitting the mark? Then you can actually start pointing to waveforms and muting things. It made a huge difference.
Yeah, and it was also creatively, it was thrilling.
And the other thing
on top of it,
I'll say from a like a composer strategy, like when we're starting, I'll try to present like in a batch, like 5 or 6, and pick some key cues. You know, you pick some big moments that you're almost afraid of addressing, because everything's going to flow downstream from those cues.
Yeah.
And you're going to start to get an idea right away what's working for yourself personally and what's working for your director partner or editor partner. So working in batches is another thing I sort of find helpful. Just so it's, because if you present one thing, it's yes or no.
Right.
But if you present one thing with options, then it's like, well, already we're having a discussion about what is working.
Right.
If you present multiple cues, you know, the discussion's going even further. So I think that working in batches is a helpful starting point for composers and directors.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Well, and I think if you both brought up an interesting point too, if you feel like something's not working, start to pull it back or pull things out and kind of like feel, you know, sometimes maybe it's just there's one instrument too many here at this port or something, or it's just too dense. And sometimes it's really a matter of pulling it back. Like, it reminds me of lighting a scene. You know, if you don't like the lighting, start turning lights off and then turning them back on again.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. Well, an hour goes so quick. We want to make sure we can get to some of the audience questions here. So, yeah, let's, Mary Lynn, do we have some audience questions we want to get to here? So, well, one to start is, let's say, composing versus arranging. How do you decide if it's one instrument or 100 instruments?
I mean, I will say that I think at heart I'm kind of a minimalist, so the fewest I can get away with is sometimes the best answer. Also, I think you just have to take a cue from whatever you're trying to create, you know, because 100 instruments don't necessarily have to be at the same time. It could be a sequential thing. You're hearing different colors as you move through. And a lot of it's also dictated by budget and time. You know, it takes a lot of time to layer that many instruments or hire that many people. So, but I think I default to what's the least amount that I need to record or perform to communicate my message, and kind of have that as the default, and then work outwards from there.
I subscribe to that too. I mean, I've seen some composers who their, you know, badge of achievement is, you know, 150 or 200 tracks in Pro Tools, and I've never subscribed to that. But I'm reminded of, like, I think Michael Giacchino talked about scoring Lost, and he just gave himself limitations from the get. I'm only working with like something crazy, like just brass and woodwinds. But there's freedom in limitations too. You know, if I only have this to work with, what can I do? And sometimes that's a lot more emancipating than every sample option in the world and every instrument option in the world.
All right, great. Yeah. How about another question from the audience? Okay. Yeah. If you all want music in early, do you buy the music or put a hold on it? Good question for the filmmakers here, I guess.
I do not buy music early. I tend to work with either temp tracks that my editor has in her library, or I'll talk to, Tom and say, hey, because yeah, I wouldn't buy music on the early end of a project.
Yeah, I guess maybe also they're referring to like if they really want a hit song that if they want to put a hold on it. This might be a question for the lawyers too in the next session.
Probably.
Yeah, I think exclusively licensing music is rare enough, especially in independent projects, that you don't really have to hold anything.
Yeah.
Because the license doesn't go into effect until the thing is released into the world. So there's always the chance that somebody else might exclusively license the thing you're working on, but I think the chances of that are quite low. So.
Yeah. But I'd say don't buy the music ahead of time if you don't need to, because you'll probably end up editing it and it doesn't work for some reason. So
right.
Yeah. All right, we got another question here. Okay, do you compose the score after final picture lock, or can the music help determine the final cut?
What is picture lock anyway?
It doesn't exist.
Yeah, I'm sure you guys have had to deal with this, but I mean, yeah, I think the score and the sound design too can often change like how you see the film and where there needs to be a breath for either a musical instrument to linger or a sound effect to linger or something like that. So I think there's a lot of times where the picture lock gets unlocked once you start moving into score and sound design.
Yeah, music is such a linear form that I always strive to have locked picture. I know it always can't happen, but when you find the perfect timings and you write your piece and then the edit changes, that it can be very frustrating. So
yeah,
as much as possible, I prefer to work to locked cut, but that's not always possible. So
it is nice these days. It heavily depends on the kind of music that you're working with, but it's audio feels so malleable that it's kind of shockingly easy sometimes to make something work. Whether you have to stretch things out or compress things or just cut bars, move things around. So yeah, it's never fun to have to kind of rearrange music to fit picture, but it's pretty amazing what you can do working in a non-linear recording environment if you have to.
Yeah. Well, I think we have time for like maybe one more question or two. Mary Lynn, do we have another one? Okay. Is it okay for a creator to reach out to you directly, or do we have to reach out to you, reach out through your agent or manager?
I have a lot of relationships that are one-on-one, and I actually prefer that. So I'm open to those interactions.
And I think if you do reach out to a musician who is represented, and you get their attention, they will just, if they want you to talk to the manager, they'll just forward the email. And yeah, it's hit or miss maybe whether you'll get a response from either the management or the artist. But if it's a cool project, then hopefully you'll hear back.
Yeah. Any other questions out there? What does the composition to your life sound like? Ooh, good question. Well, I know personally what my COVID soundtrack is, and it's been like Daft Punk to try to keep my spirits up. But
we've been listening to a lot of Yo-Yo Ma over here.
Mm.
I introduced my toddler to that, so she's now a Yo-Yo Ma super fan.
Nice. I've been like getting back to practicing violin and piano, which I haven't done really in years, but it's just kind of a nice way to focus my brain for a half hour at a time.
How about Tom, Norah? Any special
Mine changes daily. Obviously, if you stick your head in the news cycle, you definitely want to cleanse it after 2 minutes of that. So it could be lo-fi hip hop, it could be jazz or classical. Usually I'm tending towards instrumental music to listen to right now, though.
There's been a lot of live percussion going on in my house. I have a 16-year-old in the basement who set up his dream music den. So we've at any hour of the day, he's got several drum kits, vibes, bass guitar, electric guitar, acoustic guitar. So my other kid is a theater singer. So there, you just never know. I'm actually not needing to play much at all because there's always something, and it's kind of fun. So it's very varied.
Yeah.
Entertaining.
Yep. Cool. Well, thank you all for being here. This was super fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah. And for those